at the impacts of the temperature and the precipitation and the combination, in the case of the heat index, on different key sectors in the Northeast. It gives a pretty startling, some startling images. Health impacts are one, particularly in cities. You think about air quality. So obviously that temperature, you think about the incidence of asthma and where that's going to go. Or you think about pollen allergens. It turns out that ragweed loves the carbon dioxide, loves the higher temperature. So if any of you are allergy sufferers, you don't want climate change to happen. So you've got a vested interest in making sure this doesn't happen. And vector-borne disease, what do we mean by that? You've got mosquitoes carrying diseases that couldn't make it in the northern climes historically, but those diseases are going to start to spread. You think about coastal impacts. Massachusetts has, 120 miles, 128 miles of coastline. Most of our people, 4.5 million people of Massachusetts live in the counties that live in those coastal counties. So you think about coastal flooding and shoreline change, that's going to have some serious impacts, not just environmentally, but also economically. And that's going to depend in part on the sea rises. The seas are going to rise for a variety of reasons. The expansion because they're going to be warmer, but also the melting of, I'm sure you've heard about, the concerns about melting of ice caps, melting of Greenland or Antarctica. So there are various projections, but regardless, we know there's going to be an effect there. So what does that mean for, let's pick, I didn't have any slides of North Reading, but I happen to have some of Boston. So let's look at Boston. The hatched marks here on the right are what's generally considered the 100-year floodplain. Once in a century on average, that's the area that would historically get flooded. By the middle of the century, that area would start getting flooded every 2 to 3 years. By the end of the century, we're talking about once every other year under either scenario, actually. And this, what you see in blue here, is the new 100-year floodplain. So that you may recognize as downtown Boston. This is the Back Bay. Now, this doesn't mean that Boston's going to let this happen. Boston has a history of dealing with water. They know something about that. What it does mean is that we're going to have to do some serious thinking about our infrastructure. We're going to have to do some serious investment in protecting these areas. So that has an economic cost. Again, even if you don't care about the environmental aspects, you don't care about polar bears, think about your pocketbook. That's going to be some serious money to protect these areas. And on the coastlines, you're thinking about, you see more frequent, extensive coastal flooding, more coastal erosion, wetland inundation and loss. That obviously has environmental implications. It can also have economic implications. You think about all the infrastructure, all the houses we have already along the coast, whether it's Cape Cod or elsewhere. So again, serious implications there. Agricultural impacts. Here, this is another area that the study looked at. If you think about Massachusetts, we're not as big a farming state as we used to be. It's still a major part of our economy, close to $100 million a year on fruit and vegetable growing, including apples. What we know is that under the higher emission scenario, under those temperature scenario, the climate is not going to be right for some apple species that we care a lot about, Granny Smiths or Empire or Macintosh. So that has some implications for what we grow here, when we grow it. If you think about cranberry, Massachusetts grows a quarter of the nation's cranberry crop. Under the higher emission scenario, Massachusetts is not going to be right for cranberry because the effect there, it turns out that fruits like apples and cranberries need a certain amount of winter chill. They need to be below a certain temperature for a certain length of time to get the optimal flowering and fruit set to produce. So these crops are going to become increasingly non-viable in Massachusetts. Dairy production, another piece of Massachusetts. This is a map showing under that higher emission scenario what things look like under the late century. Parts of the Northeast won't be affected, but you see Massachusetts, you're looking at a 10 to 15% decline in milk production because cows don't like the heat. They don't like the dryness. They need water. They need cooler temperatures. Again, we could deal with that with air conditioners. Air condition the barn. There are technical solutions to that, but that has economic implications for our dairy farmers. Look at marine impacts. What the study did was look at two two species that have iconic status for Massachusetts, cod and lobster. You think about it, if you've gone to the State House, you know there's a carving of a sacred cod hanging there. So that's a very important species. Well, it turns out if you look at where where we're getting our cod now, the green lines represent where young cod are found. The blue lines are where adult cod are found. By the end of the century, George's Bank George's Bank even will be marginal under the higher emission scenario, will be marginal even for adult cod, and young cod won't make it. The waters will be too warm to support young cod. So, and under either scenario, the area south of Cape Cod is no longer viable for cod. So think about that, Cape Cod with no cod, Cape. Just doesn't have the same ring to it. So again, economic. It has economic implications, but it also has implications for what New England is, for what Massachusetts is. Here's another, obviously important, both historically and economically. Lobster has the highest dockside value for fishermen in Massachusetts, and here again, serious implications for where we'll be able to find lobsters under either scenario. The areas around Massachusetts won't be viable, just because the temperatures won't be right. Winter recreation, another key part of what makes New England, Massachusetts. This study looked particularly at snowmobiling and skiing. This is one of the most telling graphics in the study for me. This is the area that historically has had at least a dusting of snow for 30 days in the average winter. By the end of the century, under the higher emission scenario, white is the area that will have that kind of snow. Want to see that again? Let me just put that back. So this is, again, this was the area that historically has had at least a dusting of snow for 30 days or more in the average winter. This is what it's going to be down to. The northern reaches, the high altitude, the White Mountains, Adirondacks. That has serious implications. If you think about ski resorts, the vulnerability of ski resorts, the green dots represent the ski resorts that are viable, the red dots the ones that are non-viable. What you see is by the middle of the century and by the end of the century, you're starting to see that almost all the ski resorts in the region, certainly the ones in Massachusetts, no longer have either enough days of snow, a long enough season, or snow during the important holiday season, Christmas, New Year's, or in these cases both. Again, there's a technical fix that could do snowmaking as long as the temperature's cool enough, but that has serious economic implications, financial implications for what could also already be marginal businesses. And if you think about activities requiring natural snow, cross-country skiing, snowmobiling, sledding, you can't make snow for those. So that has implications. That has implications for just our sense of what winter is and what our kids should be doing in winter, what we're doing. It also has serious economic implications. I mean, winter recreation, skiing is a billion-dollar industry for Vermont. Snowmobiling is worth hundreds of millions of dollars for New Hampshire. So those, if you think about our region and the implications for the region. Another thing the study looked at was forest impacts. I don't know how many of you saw the Globe on Monday, but it happened to be the cover. There was a mention of it on the front page, and then it's talking about a forest of change. The whole study is about looking at how trees are going to react to climate change. And so I'm going to focus just on a couple of these areas, but tree species habitat, and my apologies, this is going to be a little hard to see, but so most of the areas under this study, including Massachusetts, is dominated by maple, beech, and birch. That's what gives us our beautiful colors, which has economic implications, obviously, because of tourism. But by the middle of the century, by the end of the century, in the lower emission scenario, we still have a healthy, a pretty significant coverage. They see the gray, which is the oak and hickory, are starting to dominate in a lot of areas, but still a lot of areas with the maple, beech, and birch. Under the higher emission scenario, virtually nothing in Massachusetts, and so those trees are confined to the higher altitude. This doesn't mean that the tree that's outside your window is going to die tomorrow or even in this century. What it does mean is that the temperatures are going to make those trees more susceptible to disease. It's going to make it harder for the young to propagate, for new trees to grow, to replace the older ones. And that has, again, serious implications for our economy and for what we think of as New England. Just quickly, if you look at the bird species, it turns out some of the bird species, don't try to read the print, but just look, some of the species are actually going to do better. Some of them are going to do worse. One of them, the black-capped chickadee, is the state bird of Massachusetts. I don't know how many of you knew that. But that's projected to actually decrease if you look at what kind of habitat they like, temperatures, their range. So you can see tufted titmouse is sitting pretty, black-capped chickadee, not so good. So key climate and impacts findings. Again, changes consistent with global warming are already in evidence across the Northeast. The pace of that change is accelerating. We're seeing this happen at a much greater stage. The next few decades, again, similar changes under either scenario because the die is cast. But then by mid-century, most changes we start seeing are greater under the higher scenario. And by late century, most changes under the higher scenario are twice those under the lower. So what do we do about that? That's pretty scary stuff, but I want to spend the rest of the time we have together talking mostly about what we do with this knowledge. So when you talk about meeting the climate change, there are two strategies really. One is reducing and one is adapting. So it turns out we need to do both. If you think about adaptation, some changes are unavoidable. As you seen, changes happening over the next 30 or 40 years are going to come either way. So we need to be preparing for that. We need to be preparing for that in terms of our infrastructure. We need to be preparing for that in terms of helping plants and animals adapt to those changes. We need to be investing in all those. But if you think about that, adaptation really has its limits. I said I wouldn't talk about polar bears. Here's one picture about polar bears. Polar bears are not, they're not very prevalent in New England, but they're going to be, obviously they're not going to be able to get in a rowboat and sail away. It's going to have serious implications. And it turns out the less we do on the mitigation, on the reducing side, the more we'll have to do on the adaptation side, and the more and more expensive it's going to get to deal with adaptation. So that says, let's do something about reducing our greenhouse gas, our climate, our greenhouse gas pollution. So meeting the climate challenge, I think it's pretty evident from the difference between the divergence between the higher emission scenario and the lower emission scenario that the further change depends greatly on us. What's important to understand is that higher emission scenario, we don't call it high emission scenario or highest emission scenario. That's the higher emission scenario, and it could get worse than that. We could start doing silly things in terms of coal to liquids, or we could abandon renewable energy completely. There are all kinds of things we can do that would put us on a path that would be worse than that. But it's also important to understand that the lower emission scenario is not a floor, that we can do better than that, and we'll talk about some of the ways we can do that. Does anybody know, when we talk about what the science says about where we need to get to by mid-century? Anybody know what kind of reductions we're talking? Just so we have a number on this.
Wasn't there was a Washington Post article that was on the internet last week that talked about we really need to get to zero emissions?
Yeah, that's right. So what we tend to talk about is that the science is telling us, and there's some materials on this back there, the science is telling us we need to have reductions of at least 80% from where we are now by the middle of the century. There are increasingly folks who are calling for reducing even more than that, reducing down to zero our emissions. And there are strategies we already have, and there are others that will be invented to get us there. So reducing on the order of 80% by middle of the century, that if we do that, and I hope we do, we will actually stay below the lower scenario that we're talking about there. So when you start thinking about solving this, the next thing to understand is that the northeastern U.S. is a big part of the problem. It has its good points and bad points. Let's talk about the bad points.